A 10-year-old black boy spoke honestly. His teacher publicly embarrassed him before the entire class. But a more significant moment occurred when his father, the mayor, entered the room silently. This incident began immediately following the morning announcements at Oakwood Elementary in Topeka, Kansas. The bell had just sounded, and the noise of chairs moving and students taking their places echoed throughout the classroom. Mrs. Trudy Holbrook was positioned at the front, arms crossed as usual, tapping her pen against the whiteboard. She was a teacher known for her rigid approach, prioritizing rules over warmth. For most students, she was acceptable, strict, but reliable. 10-year-old Malik Jefferson was seated by the window in the third row back. He was one of those students who didn't speak often, but when he did, people paid attention. Not because he was boisterous, but because he always conveyed his thoughts with purpose. He felt a surge of quiet satisfaction that morning. The night before, his dad had held a significant press conference regarding new scholarships for underserved communities. Malik had watched him on television and believed the entire city was now aware of what he already knew. His dad cared. As Mrs. Holbrook reviewed the day's plans, she announced a special visitor would be coming to the school on Friday. She stated that someone from City Hall would be present, adjusting her glasses as she spoke. They hadn't informed me of the person involved. Malik's hand rose slightly. "Yes, Malik?" she inquired, her tone already showing irritation. "I believe it could be my father," he stated calmly. "He mentioned he was traveling here this week. He holds the position of mayor." The room fell silent. Several children glanced around. One girl murmured, "Wait, is that true?" Mrs. Holbrook looked at him. She then released a brief, abrupt laugh, more of a derisive sound. "Oh, Malik, that's quite imaginative," she remarked, extending the final word as if it were hurtful. He didn't smile, didn't laugh, just sat there, eyes forward. "I'm not making it up," he said softly. "He's Mayor Jefferson," she said, her smile fading. "Malik, this is a place for learning, not for telling stories. If the mayor were your father, I think we'd all know by now, don't you?" The silence was thicker now. Some of the kids shifted in their chairs. A boy in the back let out a quiet laugh. Malik stared at the desk in front of him. His hands remained still in his lap. "Let's focus on the facts, not stories," she stated, and continued the lesson. However, the class was no longer engaged, still processing her previous statement and tone. The words were not simply dismissive, they held a sharper edge, conveying a message. "Someone like you couldn't possibly be someone like that, son." The most painful aspect wasn't the content of her words, but the swiftness with which the class embraced them. Jasmine, who typically sat with Malik at lunch, avoided looking at him for the remainder of the morning. Two boys positioned by the window murmured and chuckled each time he spoke. Malik remained silent for the rest of the lesson, not due to fear, but because he felt it wasn't worthwhile. Afterward, that same day, in the hallway, his friend Bryce approached him close to the lockers. "Hey man," Bryce said, sounding somewhat unsure. Malik didn't pause. "Yeah," Bryce acknowledged slowly. She didn't need to phrase it that way. Bryce looked down, thinking she believed he was lying. Malik offered a hesitant shrug, suggesting she tell the principal. Would it make a difference? For a moment, Bryce couldn't respond. Inside the classroom, Mrs. Holbrook resumed teaching as if nothing had occurred. She likely assumed the incident was resolved. A student had made a false statement, and a teacher had corrected him. Case closed. But that's the nature of words. They don't always fade when the school day ends. The events didn't remain confined to the classroom, as someone beyond those walls had become aware of what occurred and intended to speak out. By Thursday morning, Malik felt uncomfortable. He woke up early, as he always did, dressed, and sat through breakfast with his mom, who observed his unusual quietness. He remained largely silent. He wasn't one to express complaints. That wasn't how he was raised. Nevertheless, a weighty feeling settled in his chest. The feeling lingered, the sting of speaking honestly and being met with derision. As he entered room 204, Mrs. Holbrook had already begun writing the warm-up exercise on the board. The classroom appeared identical to the previous day. The same rows of desks, the same posters on the walls, the same teacher present. Yet, something felt different. Students whispered more frequently than usual. Several glanced in Malik's direction before quickly averting their gaze. He noticed Jasmine whispering to a classmate, her eyes flickering towards him, a giggle escaping her lips. Then came the moment that reignited the tension. Mrs. Hallbrook started a history lesson, focusing on community leaders and local government. The situation felt heavy with irony, enough to fill the entire school. As she wrote the names of elected officials on the whiteboard, she briefly looked at Malik and gave a smile, but it lacked warmth. You know, she said, addressing the class, we should always be cautious about feigning a different identity. Honesty is particularly crucial for significant positions, such as mayor or governor. She refrained from mentioning his name, yet the effect was unmistakable. Every eye in the classroom shifted toward Malik, as if by design. He remained composed, lowering his head and recording the date in his notebook. Let's return to the facts, she continued, her smile unwavering. It's easy for anyone to claim they're the mayor's child. That assertion isn't enough. Verifiable evidence is what truly matters. A chuckle arose from somewhere in the rear of the classroom. The release was sudden, a brief moment where the pressure gave way. She made no effort to restrain it. In fact, she seemed to find it amusing, as if she's told a perfectly executed jest. However, to Malik, it wasn't a jest. It wasn't an instruction either. It was a disguised humiliation, presented with a formal demeanor and a whiteboard marker in her hand. He tightened his grip on his pencil, not to damage it, merely to maintain composure. Bryce was in the front row, visibly uneasy, his mouth slightly parted as if he had something to say but couldn't articulate it. The remainder of the lesson passed quickly. For the first time, Malik didn't volunteer any answers, didn't offer to read aloud, and didn't even complete the worksheet. During recess, he walked the edge of the playground by himself. No one inquired about his well-being. They were preoccupied with continuing to laugh at the joke. Bryce rejoined him again, close to the jungle gym. You really should tell someone I did, Malik said. Who? My mom. Is she going to call the school? She told my dad. Bryce blinked. Wait, the mayor, Malik nodded. There was a pause. What's he going to do? Malik looked out past the fence. He said I should keep showing up. That sounded simple, but it hit hard. Malik didn't need his dad to yell or storm the building. He needed to know someone still believed him. And he did. That afternoon, while students engaged in silent reading, Mrs. Hallbrook introduced the topic of respecting authority. She posed several questions and then stated, and naturally, we must not pretend to be someone we are not to achieve that authority. Such actions would be dishonest and disrespectful to genuine leaders in our community. She then made eye contact with Malik for a moment that felt deliberate and directed towards him. He looked up at her and then lowered his gaze to his book. Mrs. Hallbrook turned away, likely believing the issue was resolved. Perhaps she thought her brief remarks had restored order to the classroom, that the lesson had been conveyed, and her authority reasserted. However, she was unaware that another individual had listened intently and was approaching to ensure the lesson she believed she was imparting would be entirely revised. The dining hall at Oakwood Elementary was a noisy area, not due to disorder, but because of established habits, trays making sounds, chairs scraping, juice boxes opening. But that Thursday, a different sound was present, a sound that lingered around specific tables and focused on one name, as if it were a mark. Malik was seated opposite Bryce at the far end of table 5, pushing the tater tots around on his tray. He hadn't touched his chocolate milk, which was unusual. Typically, it was the first thing he consumed. Bryce spoke softly, drawing closer. People were still discussing it. I'm aware of that. I overheard Ava mention her mother said Mayor Jefferson's son attend a private school. Malik glanced up, his brow raised. Yes, I attend a private school. I only transferred here 2 months ago. My mother wanted me nearer to her workplace. Bryce rubbed his head. I suppose people just prefer to think you're being deceptive. They'd rather believe that than accept that I'm telling the truth. They both looked down the table, where 2 kids were giggling and whispering, glancing back and forth at Malik. One of them, a boy named Derek, leaned over and said, just loud enough, guess anyone can say their dad's the mayor now, huh? Malik didn't answer. Bryce stood up halfway, then stopped himself. "Not worth it," Malik muttered. The whole room felt colder, even though the sun poured through the windows like any other day, but kids had a way of carrying an echo. A statement, once made, lingered like a marble on a tile surface. It didn't disappear simply because the speaker stopped. Jasmine walked past their table accompanied by two friends, and one of them murmured, "He still thinks he's the mayor's kid." That was the instant Bryce rose to his feet. "You'll need to be quiet," he stated, his voice wavering a little. People turned to look. Jasmine appeared surprised briefly, then folded her arms. "We're merely expressing what everyone is already thinking." Perhaps it was time for everyone to reconsider perspectives like those of Mrs. Hellbrook. A noticeable change occurred. Several students visibly reacted, some widening their eyes. A few even murmured quietly amongst themselves. Bryce quickly took a seat, his heart racing. Malik remained silent, simply observing his friend. For the first time that day, a faint smile touched his lips. However, lunch continued. A girl named Kaylee, seated at a nearby table, raised her hand partway and said, "Wait, I saw Mayor Jefferson last year at the ribbon cutting at West Park. Didn't he have a kid with him?" Bryce turned to her. "Yeah, that was Malik." She squinted. His hair was different. "It was shorter back then," Malik said, finally speaking up. Kaylee stared at him. A few kids at her table grew quiet. One appeared unsure. Another leaned in and whispered something. Gradually, the doubts started to diminish. The structure remained intact, but it shifted slightly. That's often the beginning. Not with a declaration or an explanation, but with uncertainty, quiet, and absence in the usual sounds. When the bell signaled the end of lunch, Malik took his tray and rose. He didn't hurry, and he didn't droop. He moved with the composure of someone possessing knowledge that others lacked. Bryce followed. As they headed back, passing Mrs. Hallbrook's classroom, they observed her standing close to the doorway, talking to a different teacher. She noticed them but didn't smile. She simply observed. For 1 second too long, Bryce looked toward Malik. "She knows your dad's coming, doesn't she?" Malik replied. "He said he'd stop by today." They didn't converse much after that. There was nothing further to discuss. Rumors had spread throughout the building, and whether people accepted them was irrelevant, as the truth still had more to reveal about that classroom, because something significant was already unfolding and was nearer than anyone realized. By the time Anthony Jefferson entered his office at City Hall that Thursday morning, his phone had already buzzed twice. Carla, his assistant, was waiting, holding a folder and wearing the concerned expression she reserved for sensitive matters. "It's about Malik," she stated even before he had removed his blazer. Anthony paused. "What about him?" Carla quietly closed the door. "You might want to sit down." He remained standing. She opened the folder, which contained 2 printed emails. One was from another parent concerning an incident in Mrs. Hellbrook's classroom. The second message came from the school secretary, a person Anthony had known for years, informing him about a situation where his son was being questioned in front of others by his teacher concerning his family history. Anthony read both messages deliberately, with no visible emotion. He displayed neither anger nor panic. He simply sighed. Carla observed him intently. "Should I contact the school?" he asked. "No," he replied. "I will manage it myself." She nodded and departed silently. Anthony paused, his gaze fixed on the city map adorning the wall. He held a significant position. He was the first black mayor Topeka had elected. He had contested diligently for that office, not for the prestige, but driven by a belief in the power of visibility and representation, the conviction that young people like Malik should grow up feeling a sense of belonging. He settled into his chair, reached for his phone, and dialed a number from memory. "Hello." His wife answered. "Did Malik mention anything to you?" A moment of silence followed. "He recounted yesterday's events to me," she stated. However, he didn't wish to escalate the situation. "It is a significant matter," Anthony asserted. She publicly embarrassed him before everyone. His wife released a sigh. He claimed he was fine. "He isn't." Another pause followed. "So what's your plan?" "I'm going to the school. Would you like to accompany me?" "No, but I need you to collect him afterward." "Very well," she replied softly. "Make it meaningful." He ended the call, rose, retrieve his navy suit jacket from the back of the chair, and adjusted his tie in the mirror. The situation wasn't intended to be argumentative. He avoided unnecessary disagreements. However, certain teachings require direct interaction. As he exited the building, two aides attempted to detain him with urgent requests, but he dismissed them with a courteous yet resolute gesture. "This will be brief," he stated. The driver opened the vehicle door for him without prompting. No inquiries were made regarding his destination, yet they understood, judging by his expression, that it held significance. The journey to Oakwood Elementary proceeded in silence. As the car entered the school's visitor lot, several students were concluding recess. He observed Malik across the yard, heading toward the building with another boy. His demeanor appeared more subdued than normal. Anthony did not signal, nor did he speak. He simply watched. He waited in the front office for a brief period as the receptionist placed a call to room 204. She offered him coffee. He refused. After 10 minutes, a hallway aide directed him through the corridor. He proceeded deliberately, not due to apprehension, but to observe his surroundings. He needed time to assess the environment, the kind of world his son experienced while he attended city council meetings and addressed questions from reporters. Before entering room 204, he hesitated. He detected the sounds of a lesson taking place within. He allowed the aide to resume her duties, then carefully turned the handle and opened the door. The lesson abruptly ceased, 30 sets of eyes fixed on the doorway. Standing there, tall, poised, and not smiling, was Mayor Anthony Jefferson. Unbeknownst to those in the room, this visit wasn't related to politics. It concerned fatherhood, truth, and ensuring silence wouldn't prevail. The classroom fell silent, as if someone had pressed pause. Mrs. Holbrook's mouth slightly opened. Her marker remained suspended in the air, paused halfway through writing civic responsibility on the board. She didn't move for a moment. Every student's attention shifted from her to the man standing at the entryway. Malik glanced up. He paused momentarily. It wasn't due to apprehension, but something different. A sense of ease, familiarity. The way his father occupied a space wasn't with loudness or spectacle. It was with an inherent quality, a kind that didn't solicit focus. It simply existed. Mayor Jefferson entered, without haste, without agitation. He didn't appear upset. He didn't appear self-satisfied. He appeared like a man who was fully aware of what had been stated, and who wanted it to end. Mrs. Holbrook initiated the conversation. Mayor Jefferson, acknowledging with a single nod, responded, "I'm sure it is." She moved aside a little uncomfortably, almost as if making room for him, even though she appeared somewhat displaced. The mayor surveyed the surroundings. "I'd like to address the class briefly, if that's acceptable." She paused. "I hadn't been notified of I won't take long." She retreated further. Anthony Jefferson then turned to the students. "Some of you are familiar with me, and others may not be. I am Anthony Jefferson. I serve as the mayor of this city. But more importantly," he paused and let his eyes land on Malik. "I'm Malik's dad." The silence deepened. Not a cough, not a whisper. Even the kids who had been giggling the day before were frozen now. He continued, his tone even. "Yesterday and today, my son was told by someone in authority that he couldn't possibly be who he said he was. That claiming me as his father was some kind of joke." He didn't look at Mrs. Holbrook. Not once. Everyone understood who he was referring to. "I'm not intending to cause anyone discomfort. I don't support that approach. However, I do value significant instances. These are times when individuals gain an understanding of what respect entails and what it doesn't." He paused and looked around the classroom. Respect involves attentive listening, even when a person's narrative differs from your preconceived notions. It requires trusting a student when they speak, particularly when they are sharing their genuine experiences. And it necessitates acknowledging that your expectations do not determine another person's lived reality. A young woman in the front row fidgeted. Malik observed silently, without blinking, carefully taking in every word. Anthony continued. "Serving as mayor involves more than just legislation or official gatherings. It's about demonstrating the right behavior. My son didn't require me to protect him. He needed me to be present. And here I am, yet still no one moved. Then, gradually, he turned to address the woman seated at the room's front. Mrs. Holbrook, he said, his voice remaining even, I expect this won't recur. Not to my son, and not to any student. She started to speak, but remained silent. Only a brief, hesitant nod followed. He understood and addressed the class, saying, I'll leave you to your learning. Malik's gaze met his son's. We'll talk later, Malik acknowledged, nodding in return. A sense of release washed over him. The first easing he's felt all day. Mayor Jefferson departed without a ceremony or applause. The silence was profound, echoing more powerfully than any possible outburst. In the hallway, Anthony hesitated. He felt no need to glance over his shoulder. Within the classroom, there was no laughter. There was no murmuring. Mrs. Holbrook remained motionless, her hands clasped firmly. The lesson had ceased, yet a different atmosphere had begun. Despite the mayor's departure from the room, the consequences lingered. They persisted significantly. Certain statements cannot be undone, and certain realities remain even after the door shuts. The remainder of the school day proceeded sluggishly, as if the power had been disconnected. The students were more subdued, demonstrating greater concentration. It wasn't fear that prompted their actions, but a heightened understanding. A tangible change had occurred. Mrs. Holbrook attempted to resume her previous approach. Her tone remained even, yet her hands trembled slightly as she handled the marker. She avoided eye contact, refrained from calling on Malik, and made no further mention of civic responsibility. Malik, meanwhile, adopted a more upright posture. He displayed no smile. He made no effort to demonstrate anything. He simply listened, recorded notes, responded to questions when prompted, as was his usual practice. This time, however, the students were attentive. When the bell signaled the end of class and backpacks were being packed, the students departed more deliberately. Several cast quick looks in Malik's direction as they passed. A few offered a quiet, "See you," or gave subtle nods of acknowledgement. Jasmine paused near the door, appearing as though she desired to speak, but ultimately left with her friends. Bryce remained near Malik's desk. "Are you all right?" Bryce asked. "I'm fine," Malik replied. Then he didn't raise his voice. Bryce affirmed. It wasn't necessary. What resonated most with people was the manner in which Mayor Jefferson entered that classroom, conveyed what was necessary, and departed without raising his voice. There was no yelling, no intimidation, no theatrical display. He simply stated the truth. And truth requires no amplification. It only needs to be spoken. Subsequently that afternoon, Mrs. Holbrook sat alone at her desk as the halls emptied. Her fingers paused above her keyboard, a blank email draft displayed before her. The expression in Anthony Jefferson's eyes lingered in her thoughts. It wasn't anger, nor cruelty, simply disappointment, and a certainty as if he'd witnessed similar actions repeatedly and was weary of them. She replayed her words, not only those spoken to Malik, but those spoken near him about him. The sarcasm, the tone, the incredulity, they now reverberated, prominent and unwelcome. No reprimand had been issued. No public exposure had occurred. However, the sense of shame was genuine, and it remained. She closed the email without composing a reply. Later that evening, Malik was on the couch completing his homework when his dad entered the room. He loosened his tie and sat down next to him. "You conducted yourself admirably," Anthony remarked. Malik looked up. "I didn't do anything." "You didn't yield, you didn't recede, and that's significant," his father responded. Malik shut his notebook. "Why didn't you speak to her earlier?" he inquired. "I wanted you to develop your own voice initially," his father explained. However, when someone discredits your reputation in front of a group of people, it's no longer a subtle matter. It becomes a public affair. And I don't allow public disrespect to go unaddressed. Malik paused briefly. He observed that she appeared frightened, and she should have felt responsible. A period of silence followed, where they felt at ease and were being truthful. Subsequently, Malik's mom brought in dinner. The television displayed the evening news in the background. The school remained quiet. There were no announcements or public discussion, but the necessary events had transpired. The following day at school, an altered atmosphere prevailed. It wasn't a miraculous resolution, but a palpable shift. Mrs. Holbrook addressed the class with a more subdued demeanor. She refrained from excessive corrections or a manufactured apology, and the sharpness was absent from her voice. Her eyes no longer expressed frustration when Malik raised his hand. And when he briefly referred to his father in a writing assignment, she remained silent. Malik's classmates gave him more room. Some even showed him a quiet deference, not due to his father's identity, but because of how he had dealt with the situation. Calm, honest, steadfast. These were the qualities that resonated. However, even as the familiar patterns returned, one thing became evident. The truth had been disseminated, and the surrounding hush had finally ceased. The Monday following, the school hallways were as lively as they always were. The sound of sneakers on the floor, the clang of lockers, and the echoes of laughter filled the hallways. Yet, a subtle change had occurred, not only in room 204, but throughout the entire school. Students were no longer speaking about Malik in hushed tones. Instead, they observed him with a different kind of attention, not with the air of legend, not with the amusement of a shared joke, but with the recognition of someone who had faced a challenge head-on and remained steadfast. Malik walked through the hall with Bryce, as was their usual routine. But Bryce was the first to recognize it. Students seemed to make way a bit faster. Some even offered silent nods as they passed. It wasn't from fear, it was a sign of respect. It wasn't solely because Malik's dad held the office of mayor, it was Malik's own quiet confidence, which needed no justification. At lunchtime, Jasmine finally went to their table. "Hey," she said, holding her tray. Malik looked up. "Hi." Malik paused. "I just wanted to say, I didn't mean to laugh. I didn't think it was amusing. I don't know." He reassured her. "It's all right," he said. "Just, please don't participate next time." She acknowledged him, seeming slightly ashamed, and left. That's the nature of change. It doesn't always manifest as a significant event. Occasionally, it comes through uncomfortable dialogues and understated choices. Mrs. Holbrook never issued a formal apology. However, during the subsequent week, she began phrasing her inquiries differently. She included Malik more frequently. She smiled, but not with that rigid, artificial expression. It was presented in a manner suggesting an attempt at improvement, even without expressing it verbally. She also sent a handwritten, brief note home at the end of the week. Malik continues to contribute insight and maturity to the classroom. "Thank you for raising such a respectful young man." His father read it in the kitchen and remained silent. He simply handed it to Malik and offered a quiet nod of approval. In the weeks that followed, Malik's name was no longer solely connected to his father. Children began sharing stories about how he consistently provided the best answers in science class. They recalled how he assisted Ava in locating her missing library book. They noted how he defended a third grader who had dropped his tray in the lunchroom. The narrative concerning the mayor entering room 204 was, naturally, still recounted. However, it wasn't the humorous ending that resonated. It was the underlying message. That dignity carries more weight than loudness. That truth doesn't invariably require corroboration, but warrants acknowledgement. It's important that even a classroom, particularly a classroom, should not be a place where someone is told what they cannot be. Malik did not revisit the matter. He didn't need to. He demonstrated what needed demonstrating. His father had expressed what needed expressing, and the silence that previously attempted to overwhelm him had been broken. Several weeks later, during an assembly concerning leadership, the principal highlighted the significance of presence. She refrained from naming anyone, yet all those seated in the folding chairs understood the subject of her remarks. Prior to their departure that afternoon, Bryce turned to Malik and quietly said, "You know she was referencing you, correct?" Malik offered a slight shrug. "Perhaps." Bryce smiled. "The next occasion someone accuses you of dishonesty, I'm merely gesturing towards the door and anticipating your dad's arrival." Malik chuckled. No way. Next time, I'll address it personally. And he was sincere. While his dad had walked in that day to say what needed to be said, Malik had done something even harder. He stayed. He sat through the laughter, the whispers, the weight of being doubted. And he never faltered. And that kind of strength doesn't come from titles or headlines. It comes from knowing who you are, even when someone else tries to rewrite your story. Some bruises fade, but lessons, the ones worth remembering, they last a lifetime. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe and share it with someone who would benefit from hearing it. Stories like this are important, as respect, identity, and truth should never be compromised. According to my mom, she works at NASA. The entire class laughed until someone with a badge entered the room and altered the atmosphere. It was a Tuesday, shortly after recess, and the classroom had a subtle scent of hand sanitizer and pencil shavings. Ms. Lawson had just finished roll call when she clapped her hands and announced, "All right, it's time for our What My Parent Does presentations." One after another, students share their stories. A father who worked as a firefighter, a mother employed a local bakery, a brother serving in the Army who was acknowledged with a round of applause, even though technically he didn't count. Next came Talia Jefferson's introduction. She rose deliberately, clutching a small index card displaying her name in purple ink. Talia was known as one of the quieter students in class. She was intelligent but preferred not to raise her hand simply to speak. She surveyed the room, making no direct eye contact, and stated distinctly, "My mom works at NASA." A pause followed. Then came quiet chuckles, escalating into laughter, not a sudden outburst, but a wave that grew stronger as confused and amused glances circulated. "Wait, NASA?" Someone called from the rear. "You mean like the space agency?" Another voice whispered, perhaps a little too loudly. Even Ms. Lawson seemed surprised. She didn't laugh. Instead, her eyebrows rose a little, as if she found it difficult to accept. Talia blinked deliberately, remaining silent and still. She didn't shout. She didn't flee. She simply stood, her expression composed, her hands unwavering. "Yes," she confirmed, stating that she works at NASA and is a systems engineer. The word seemed out of place. Ms. Lawson, positioned close to the board, offered a strained smile, signaling a transition to the next item. "Well, thank you, Talia," she said, already looking over her clipboard. Next, it was Owen's turn. Talia resumed her seat, disregarding the laughter and the subtle gestures. Her fingers tightened around the bottom of her shirt. Her expression remained composed, though her cheeks felt flushed. Owen began to discuss his dad's plumbing business, but Talia registered very little of what he said. She was certain they didn't accept her story, not a single one of them, not even the teacher. They found the task unbelievable, but even more so, they doubted the individual presenting it. A girl with deep brown skin, her tight braids secured with a soft pink scrunchie. She carried a hand-me-down backpack with a broken zipper. Her shoes were well worn, and she didn't use elaborate language or speak with great volume. Therefore, when she mentioned NASA, it sounded to them like a fantasy, like a game. During Owen's presentation, a piece of paper was passed to her desk. A boy named Theo leaned towards her and asked if she cleaned the bathrooms or something. Talia remained silent. She didn't cry, not at that moment. As the bell signaled the end of class and students scrambled for their backpacks, she remained seated, her gaze fixed on the classroom door. She had never before wished her mom held a different position, one that was simpler to discuss, one that didn't invite curious glances. Nevertheless, even then, she held onto the conviction that it was important. Her mom had once shared with her that some truths are too profound for limited understanding. One simply allows them to mature. Talia exited that classroom with her head held high, despite a knot in her stomach. She felt no personal shame. Her concern was for those around her. However, she was unaware that the learning experience wasn't complete. This applied to her classmates and to Ms. Lawson as well. The Jefferson House was located close to a peaceful road in Mobile, Alabama. It wasn't ostentatious, but it was neat, painted a light yellow with green shutters. It was the sort of place where the porch light was consistently illuminated before nightfall. and the screen door made a slight creak upon entry. Talia entered through that door at a slower pace than normal. Removing her sneakers, she dropped her backpack close to the staircase and went directly to the kitchen. The aroma of garlic and onions indicated her mom had arrived home earlier than usual. Dr. Renee Jefferson was at the stove, stirring something in a large red pot. She didn't immediately acknowledge her. "You're late," she stated, not unkindly, simply observing it. Talia selected a chair and sat down. "Had to remain behind to clean the desks," she murmured. Renee turned, observed her daughter's expression, and adjusted the flame. Talia remained silent for a moment. Her hands rested in her lap, nervously playing with the sleeves of her hoodie. She appeared eager to speak, but struggled to begin. "We laughed," Talia said at last. Renee understood immediately who she meant. She drew out the chair opposite her daughter and sat. There were no outbursts, no displays of shock or fear. "Why? I informed them that you were employed at NASA." Renee gave a barely perceptible nod, "and they didn't believe you. One kid suggested you might have cleaned the bathrooms." Renee took a shallow breath, a momentary pause to compose herself. "And what was your response?" "You didn't offer one." Ms. Lawson quickly moved on, seemingly avoiding the issue. That action caused Renee's eyebrows to twitch almost imperceptibly, but she maintained a level tone. "Do you think you said something incorrect?" Talia glanced up sharply. "No. Don't accept their lack of understanding as your fault." They laughed. "And that's their responsibility, not yours." A moment of silence followed as the bubbling from the pot filled the space. Outside, a dog barked twice and then stopped. "You know," Renee said, rising to stir the food again, "when I first told people I wanted to work in aerospace, my high school guidance counselor told me to be more realistic. Said I should consider secretarial work." Talia looked up, eyes wide. That occurred in 1998. I didn't engage in an argument with her. I simply ceased visiting her office. Did it cause pain? Renee extinguished the stove and turned to her daughter. Yes, but also ignited a spark. I wasn't feeling anger towards her. I was resolved not to allow her to dictate who I could be. Talia smiled. Just a little. She appreciated that her mom consistently found a way to speak honestly, but not in a sensationalized way. There was resilience in her composure. "You know, I could attend your class," Renee mentioned casually. "Parent days are this Friday, correct?" Talia blinked. "You do that?" she asked. "I get the day off anyway, and it might be fun." Renee replied, "But what would you wear?" Talia's eyes lit up. Renee grinned. "I was thinking maybe my NASA badge and that black blazer you hate." Talia responded, "Okay, yeah, do that." They both laughed then, a real, from-the-belly kind of laughter. The air in the kitchen felt lighter. Renee served them both bowls of stew and set them on the table. While they ate, she shared stories with Talia about her first job interview and the time she accidentally spilled coffee on a flight simulator keyboard. The stories made Talia giggle, and she no longer felt small. She felt lucky. "Remember," Renee said as they finished, "you don't owe anyone proof. But if the moment comes when you feel like showing them, just know I've got your back." Talia nodded slowly, cheeks full of food and her badge. Renee smirked that too. She wasn't intending to simply make a statement. She aimed to transform the atmosphere of the room. Talia hadn't realized this yet. Friday arrived sooner than Talia anticipated. Throughout the entire week, rumors continued to circulate within the classroom, much like dust in sunlight. Several students attempted apologies through hesitant gestures. One offered her a crushed fruit snack. Another quietly said, "I was just joking." However, the majority behaved as if nothing had occurred. This suited Talia just fine. She hadn't forgotten. As the morning bell signaled the start of the day, the classroom was filled with excited energy. Ms. Lawson had organized the desks in a horseshoe shape, creating space for parents to be seated and present. She wore a purple blouse and had placed a tray of sugar cookies, clearly purchased from a grocery store, as a somewhat feeble attempt to create a celebratory atmosphere. Talia was positioned near the center, her backpack carefully placed beneath her chair. She felt anxious, though not frightened. It was a feeling of anticipation. She had not informed anyone that her mom would be present. The first parents arrived approximately at 9:15. This included a man wearing a mechanic's uniform, a woman in scrubs, and several moms carrying tote bags and Starbucks cups, who greeted with somewhat overenthusiastic smiles and waves. The presentation commenced, punctuated by applause and gentle laughter. One dad shared a story about repairing a sink that had unexpectedly burst. Another mom recounted her experience of teaching yoga to toddlers. Talia repeatedly looked toward the door. Precisely as Ms. Lawson began introducing the subsequent speaker, the door opened. Dr. Renee Jefferson entered the room. She was wearing the black blazer that Talia found so off-putting, perfectly tailored and crisp. Her NASA Johnson Space Center identification badge hung from a Navy lanyard, paired with black slacks and no jewelry except for a silver watch. Her expression was calm, not smug, not flashy, simply present. The room fell silent instantly. Even the air seemed to still. Ms. Lawson stammered, and Talia stood up, announcing, "This is my mom, Dr. Renee Jefferson." The teacher's eyes widened momentarily before a smile spread across their face. "All right, welcome." They gestured. "Would you like to tell us about your work?" Renee responded with a courteous nod. "Certainly. Good morning, everyone. I'm an aerospace systems engineer at NASA. I work on mission planning, flight systems integration, and operation strategy for our lunar and Mars programs." Several heads turned in the direction of Talia. A few mouths dropped open, and one student quietly whispered, "Whoa." Renee proceeded calmly. Her voice had a measured cadence, clear, smooth, and steady. "A significant portion of my work focuses on designing systems that ensure astronauts can travel safely in space. We examine all aspects, from their respiration to the transmission of data back to Earth." She paused, allowing the statement to sink in. "I'm not here to impress you," she added, observing the room. "I came here because my daughter mentioned she's spoken with you, and some of you expressed doubt about my work." Silence. Talia could hear her own heartbeat. She refused to blink. Renee approached the whiteboard and indicated a printed diagram she had prepared, a genuine schematic from a previous project. "You don't need to grasp every detail. That's perfectly acceptable," she stated, addressing the group. "But the next time you hear something that seems unbelievable, pause before dismissing it. Because innovation can emerge unexpectedly," she said, then turned to her daughter. "And when someone shares a truth with conviction, allow it to remain as it is, don't diminish it." Ms. Lawson cleared her throat. "Thank you, Dr. Jefferson. That was very enlightening." Renee smiled and walked over to sit beside Talia, who was trying not to grin. The room proceeded slowly after that. The next parent began their presentation about running a car dealership. There was no laughter, no whispering. And Talia, she sat up straighter than she ever had before. She didn't look around for affirmation. She didn't require it. At that moment, her truth resonated strongly, accessible to all present. However, many failed to recognize that the woman they had just encountered hadn't always experienced being heard. Her journey to NASA encompassed countless instances mirroring this one. Prior to becoming Dr. Renee Jefferson, she was simply Renee Lewis, a slender teenager with oversized glasses and notebooks filled with diagrams that held no interest for anyone else in her neighborhood. Growing up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, she lived in a house with a sagging front porch, raised by a mother who worked 2 jobs to pay the bills. From a young age, she preferred machines to makeup. While other girls enjoyed playing jump rope, Renee constructed small devices from discarded fans and obsolete cassette players. Her uncle once described her as odd, but she viewed that as a positive attribute. At 13, she borrowed a book from the public library about space shuttles and devoured it completely in a single night. By 14, she was independently learning fundamental programming concepts. She rarely discussed this at school. She quickly discovered that expressing a desire to work at NASA would often result in ridicule or dismissal. Her educators didn't encourage her. This wasn't due to a lack of intelligence. Renee consistently earned straight A's across all subjects. Instead, they had formed preconceived notions about her future. "You'd be exceptionally organized," one counselor remarked to her. "You'd excel as a receptionist." Upon mentioning her intention to apply to a summer program for young engineers at Georgia Tech, Her math teacher expressed surprise. He remarked that it was highly competitive and questioned if she was certain about spending the application fee. Despite this, she submitted her application and was accepted. That summer proved transformative. She found herself among peers who approached problem solving in a similar manner, with notebooks brimming with questions and uninhibited curiosity. She returned with a collection of blueprints and a newfound sense of purpose. College presented its own challenges. At Auburn University, she found herself one of just 3 black women within the entire engineering department. During collaborative assignments, she frequently was asked to record notes rather than work on calculations. Instructors continued to mispronounce her name, even after 3 semesters had passed. Despite these difficulties, she remained steadfast, consistently attending classes. Renee supported herself by working evenings at a diner close to campus and providing tutoring services to high school students on weekends. There were moments when she contemplated abandoning her studies. It wasn't a matter of her inability to manage the workload. The difficulties stemmed from the draining effort of constantly having to demonstrate her place. During one spring, following a successful thermodynamics midterm, she overheard 2 classmates speaking privately behind her. One suggested she must have received assistance, and the other speculated she may have copied from another student. Instead of confronting them, she didn't shed tears. She simply returned home, opened her textbook, and began preparing for the upcoming finals. By the semester's conclusion, she achieved the top rank within her department. It was an unspoken understanding amongst them, but they recognized it. Following graduation, she completed an internship at Lockheed Martin. Subsequently, she submitted an application to NASA, which she considered a long shot. However, her qualifications were undeniable. The acceptance call arrived in March while she was in a laundromat, surrounded by wet towels and with only one dryer operational. Her mother wept on the phone for a full 5 minutes. From there, the substantial effort commenced. The meetings, the designs, the late nights, the subtle glances in conference rooms, the moments where she had to repeat herself 3 times to be heard. But she persisted in voicing her thoughts, because whenever she worked at a console or drafted a fresh concept, she recalled a younger version of herself who only needed one person to believe it was achievable. Now, as she entered her daughter's 5th grade classroom, the badge swaying from her neck, she represented more than just herself. She stood for every girl who had ever been told, "People like you don't do that." However, this wasn't about proving a point anymore. It was about establishing something new in her daughter, a foundation that couldn't be undermined. The following Monday, subtle changes were noticeable, not in a dramatic fashion, but through small shifts. The shift was subtle, something you'd only perceive if you were paying close attention. When Talia entered class, she anticipated no special welcome, and none arrived, but the atmosphere felt different. People didn't visibly react when she spoke. Theo didn't whisper. In fact, he completely avoided looking at her. During recess, 2 girls, Kennedy and Samira, approached her near the jungle gym. They stood nearby, uncomfortably, shifting their weight. "My mom said your mom's speech was really something," Kennedy said, chewing her bottom lip. "She seemed intelligent, genuinely so." "She is," Talia answered promptly. Samira concurred. "I researched NASA after school," she explained. "It's quite interesting." That was their brief exchange. Yet they remained. And for the first time all year, the 3 of them settled on the bench and discussed a topic beyond snack trades or slime videos. Later that day, Ms. Lawson spoke privately with Talia as the class prepared to leave. "I wanted to say something," she began, her voice softer than normal. Regarding last week, Talia looked up, attentive. "I should have managed that situation differently," Ms. Lawson continued. "I ought to have asked more questions rather than proceeding so quickly. I apologize." Talia wasn't certain how to respond. She rarely encountered adults offering apologies in that manner. She nodded once, deliberately. That was sufficient for the present, though not everyone experienced a change of perspective. Certain children still spoke in hushed tones, but they did so with greater discretion. Some observed her with an expectation of failure, seemingly needing her to falter to reaffirm their own perspectives. One boy, Dean, would quietly say NASA kid whenever she passed, as if attempting to diminish her accomplishments. Talia remained composed. She did not react defensively or retreat. Instead, she continued her efforts. She engaged more frequently in class, volunteering answers even when uncertain of the correctness. Now, even making mistakes didn't intimidate her, not as it once had. One afternoon during group work, she overheard a classmate say, "She thinks she's better than us." Talia looked up calmly and replied, "No, I just know I belong here." No further debate followed. At home, Renee observed the change as well. Talia spoke more at dinner, sharing small details about her day without needing to be prompted repeatedly. And she began drawing again, shifting away from cartoons towards diagrams, similar to those her mother created. Rockets, helmets, star maps in pencil. One evening, Renee discovered a post-it note affixed to the fridge. It stated, "I'm going to work there too, love, Talia." She left it untouched for 3 days. However, this wasn't solely about demonstrating assurance. A more profound shift had occurred within Talia. It was no longer a matter of disproving anyone. It was about embracing her own authenticity, recognizing truth regardless of criticism. During gym class, when the teacher requested they write down a goal not related to sports, Talia wrote, "Engineer, space missions just like my mom." When the teacher announced it, there were no laughs. The class simply listened. However, at home, a different feeling arose. It was a still moment shared between mother and daughter, solidifying all they had experienced. It was Friday night again. A full week had passed since Parent Day, and the house was filled with the aroma of Renee's renowned lemon chicken. Talia sat at the kitchen table, sketching a new design, a rotating satellite with solar panels shaped like flower petals. She worked quietly, pausing occasionally to erase or examine an angle. Renee watched from the sink, carefully drying a dish. The focused way her daughter drew, with her tongue slightly pressed against her upper lip, brought back memories of herself at 12, always constructing something in her mind. "Would you like to take a break?" Renee asked softly. Talia looked up. "Almost finished." Renee smiled, resting against the counter. "You've been working on that for 2 hours." Talia replied, "I know, I just wanted to look right." She completed the final line and showed the paper to her mom. Renee approached and examined it closely. "Explain it to me." Talia said, "Well, it's a satellite, but instead of keeping all the panels flat, they open up like this." She demonstrated the shape with her hands, so it can collect more energy when it turns, depending on the angle of the sun. Renee acknowledged with a nod, clearly impressed. "That's a clever approach. Where did that idea originate?" Talia replied, "I'm not entirely sure. I had been considering sunflowers earlier, observing how they track the sun's movement. The concept simply arose." Renee took a seat next to her, carefully placing the paper on the table. "You know what I appreciate most about that idea?" She inquired. "What?" Renee responded. "You weren't attempting to make a favorable impression. You were simply striving to resolve an issue." Talia glanced at the drawing once more. "Yes, I suppose so." They remained there for a moment in quiet contemplation. A comfortable silence settled. Then Talia spoke again, her voice gentler. "Do you think they truly believed me?" After you left, Renee placed her hand on the table. "Some did, some still don't. That's not something you can always manage. So what is the solution? You continue to reappear. That's the challenging aspect. Not a single time, but repeatedly. You articulate the truth, even when it seems as though nobody listens." Talia considered that as you did. Renee offered a gentle smile, similar to the one I still offer. "Was it always this difficult for you?" Renee reclined in the chair, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes more so, but I stopped expecting it to become simple." Talia regarded her mother, seeing her not only as a parent, but as an individual. Someone who had overcome obstacles she hadn't even been aware of. Someone who possessed quiet strength without needing external validation. "I used to wish you had a conventional job." Renee laughed, something straightforward to describe. Talia observed her mother's reaction, recognizing the discomfort when people inquired. "Now, I find it quite admirable, truly admirable." Renee reached out and gently tucked one of her daughter's braids behind her ear. "I'm proud of you, she said. "Not because of what you said in class, but because you said it anyway. Talia felt a warmth in her chest, not just pride, but relief. A weight she hadn't noticed until it started to lift. I didn't think you were going to come that day, she admitted. Renee raised an eyebrow. Why not? She asked. I thought maybe you'd think it wasn't worth it. Renee hesitated. Then she moved nearer, speaking with a resolute and unwavering tone. Anything that impacts your self-perception is always deserving of support. Little needed to be said after that. Talia rose and proceeded to the refrigerator, took a magnet, and attached her artwork directly beside the grocery list. Renee observed her, feeling a sense of quiet contentment. Not every learning experience warranted recognition. Some simply existed, perceptible only to those who had rightfully gained them. There remained one final point to share, not directed at Talia, but for those still discovering what excellence resembles. The following week, during the morning announcements, Ms. Lawson took an unanticipated action. She presented a student submission from the Career Dreams bulletin board and read it aloud to the class. This one is from Talia Jefferson, she announced. She wrote, I want to build machines that will reach places no person has ever reached because someone must discover how to get us there, and I believe I can. There was no laughter this time, only silence. Several students turned to observe her, not with incredulity, but with something approaching respect. Talia sat at her desk, serene and concentrated, sketching miniature gears in the borders of her notebook. She didn't require a glance upward, nor did she need the room to applaud. That wasn't the focus, as this narrative was never centered on recognition. It concerned honesty, about maintaining conviction when others expressed doubt, about the significance of speaking clearly, not noisily. However, the individuals in that classroom had observed something unexpected. A woman with qualifications, certainly. Beyond that, she was a woman with a clear sense of self, someone who didn't require authorization to express herself, and a daughter who witnessed her interspaces devoid of faith and yet infused them with strength. Renee didn't need to speak loudly. She didn't need to detail her achievements. Her presence was sufficient. However, it was Talia who bore the burden of that day. She endured the flames of mockery, remained within them, and emerged stronger. It can be challenging to express self-belief, particularly when facing a lack of external validation. The core message extends beyond the nature of a parent's profession or the perceived grandeur of their role. It centers on the lessons we impart to our children, not through spoken words, but through demonstrable actions. Affirming your child instills resilience. Consistently supporting them cultivates bravery. Even a brief moment in a crowded room, standing near them, demonstrates what it truly means to be heard. When a child experiences being seen, not only by a teacher or a classmate, but by the wider world, they cease to diminish their presence. They stop doubting themselves. They begin to carry themselves with the confidence of someone who has something significant to contribute. Because they do. Talia no longer needed to persuade anyone. She wasn't waiting for the class to accept her. She had already moved forward, now concentrating on what she thought achievable. This is what makes narratives like hers significant. Because for each child who has been ridiculed, overlooked, or interrupted, there's another opportunity awaiting. A moment when the door opens, when the badge is displayed, when silence transforms into respect, and it remains with them. At the conclusion of the school year, when the class created their memory book, a page was designated most likely to. Beneath Talia's photograph, a message read, seemingly with the intention of sending something into space. She reacted with a smile, not due to the coolness of the statement, but because this time it appeared to be genuine. Therefore, the next time a child expresses a significant aspiration, refrain from immediate skepticism. Avoid limiting their potential to your current understanding. Allow them to surpass your expectations. And for parents observing this, be present, even when it feels challenging, particularly when it's truly important. Vocalize your belief in them. For more stories like this, please subscribe. These are stories that highlight true strength. He entered the bank, his appearance marked by a tattered coat and old shoes. People assumed he was simply another person experiencing homelessness. Then he spoke calmly, stating, "I own the land this building sits on," and presented documentation to support his claim. The door chimes sounded as it always did upon entry, yet few people acknowledged it. They barely glanced up. A few fleeting looks were all it received. One woman subtly shifted her position to observe him before returning to her computer screen. Another took a sip of her coffee and rolled her eyes, murmuring something to the teller beside her. A man entering the space appeared out of sync with the surroundings, not threatening, simply different. The environment consisted of shiny glass, polished tile, and Bluetooth headsets visible behind the counters. This was Morris Coltrane Langston, age 62, with a thick gray beard. His coat was 2 sizes too large, and his jeans suggested a past no one wished to explore. He moved deliberately, not due to age, but with caution. Each step felt significant, as if he were assessing his place within the setting. He approached the counter where Brittany was working. She offered him a brief look. "Sir, a bank card or ID is required for withdrawals," she stated plainly. Morris offered a gentle smile, though it seemed weary. "I don't require a withdrawal. I need to discuss property," he said. Brittany's eyes widened slightly. She glanced at her colleague, who was visibly trying to contain laughter. "Property?" she asked. "Yes," he confirmed. "I believe I own the land this bank is built on." At that moment, the laughter erupted. The message originated from Cliff Yarrow, the assistant branch manager, who had approached, arms crossed. Cliff was a man who displayed his authority prominently. He made no attempt to conceal his amusement. "Sir, I believe you are at the incorrect building," Cliff stated. "This is not the county records office. You cannot simply enter and declare ownership of a bank." "I did not say I own the bank," Maurice responded, his voice quiet. "I said I own the land. There's a distinction." Now, all eyes were upon him. The security guard, identified as Lee, who typically appeared to be checking his phone near the door, stood up straighter and moved forward. Cliff questioned, "Do you have any paperwork to back that up?" Maurice slowly reached into his coat pocket. For a moment, Lee reacted, conditioned by experience to anticipate a potential threat when a black man reached into a pocket. However, Morris's movements were unhurried and non-threatening. He carried the envelope deliberately, as if accustomed to it. He produced a thick, crumpled packet. The pages were yellowed with worn edges, having been folded and unfolded numerous times. At the top, it read, "Franklin Delroy, 1913 land deed." Below that were stamped legal seals and notary signatures. "I've held on to this since my father passed," I said. "And he kept it since his father passed," Maurice added. The deed belonged to a black-owned cooperative that obtained plots throughout this section of Knoxville during the Reconstruction era. I tapped the envelope gently. "This confirms my grandfather did not sell the land. It was leased. Ownership returned to us following a default, though this information was never shared." Brittany's smirk disappeared. Lee stopped scrolling. Cliff cleared his throat. "I believe it's time for you to leave, sir," he stated. "I think it's time someone examines the contents," Maurice said calmly. Then, an unexpected event occurred. A man from the office furthest to the left, John Delgado, the branch manager, emerged. He had been observing through the glass for the preceding few minutes. He requested the documents. Morris provided them immediately. John escorted them back to his office. A period of silence followed, lasting briefly. Subsequently, 5 minutes elapsed, then 10. Eventually, John appeared. His expression was altered. "Connect me with regional compliance on the line." Immediately, he stated. As phones began to ring and conversations grew concerned, Maurice remained still at his position by the counter. He was anticipating something, and they all understood, instinctively, that it wasn't a monetary request. Cliff walked back and forth behind the teller row, massaging the back of his neck, as if that would aid his comprehension of what he's heard. John Delgado continued on the phone, speaking in brief, strained sentences to someone at corporate. His office blinds were partially closed, but every few seconds, a glimpse of his face emerged from the gap. He wasn't smiling anymore. Brittany stood uncomfortably at her station, looking sideways at Maurice, who hadn't moved from his position. His hands were folded, and documents rested gently on the counter in front of him. "Do you want to sit down?" she finally asked, her voice softer. Maurice shook his head. "I've done enough sitting in my life." A man in a tailored suit and thick-rimmed glasses walked in briskly from a back entrance. His ID badge read Gerald Tisdale, Regional Property and Compliance. He went straight to Delgado's office without a word. Moments later, John opened the door again and waved for Maurice. "Sir, would you mind stepping in for a moment?" Maurice nodded once and retrieved his envelope. His boots made a slight scuffing sound against the tile as he entered the office. As the door closed behind him, the remaining staff members quieted. No one spoke. Even the security guard adjusted his position, uncertain whether to remain nearby or act as if nothing was occurring. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. "Mr. Langston," Gerald stated cautiously, "I've reviewed the original deed and the tax history you provided. Could you please tell us where you've been keeping these documents?" "My father kept it in a box of his belongings," Maurice responded. "He was a carpenter, building houses in Alcoa and Maryville before his knees failed. After he passed away, I kept the papers in a locker at a storage unit I used when I lacked permanent housing." Delgado appeared astonished. "You're saying this land was never sold? That the trust was still active?" Maurice retrieved a smaller, more recent envelope and gave it to Gerald. Inside was a typed letter from a small firm in Chattanooga, a probate specialist named Lena Fry, confirming the lapse in city filings and the reversion clause in the original agreement. The letter was dated 6 months ago. I only found it after she assisted me in reviewing some of my dad's old files. "Thought it was junk at first," Gerald said, staring at the paper. His mouth opened a little, but he didn't speak. "Legally," Maurice explained, "this building stood on land that was part of my grandfather's estate. The lease agreement had been temporary. As the bank underwent mergers and changes in ownership over the years, the arrangement wasn't renewed. They simply built on the land, presuming no one would inquire." Delgado rubbed his temple. "That represented decades of transactions," Maurice stated, "and not a single one examined the records far enough back. Everyone seemed to think the past had resolved itself." Gerald rose quickly and gazed out the office window. "We need to involve legal right away," he stated. "Already done," John responded quietly. A voice drifted from outside the office, speaking too loudly. Why would a homeless man return for this now? What would he possibly do with a piece of land beneath a bank? Inside, Maurice noticed. He glanced towards the window, then resumed looking at Gerald. "I didn't come for money," he said. "I came seeking the truth, and perhaps a measure of respect." Gerald turned, finally meeting my eyes. There was a pause. "You are not wrong, but while discussions focused on compliance and liability, something else was unfolding in the lobby. Whispers had escalated to murmurs, and one employee was already texting someone outside the bank. The story, as it turns out, began long before Maurice ever entered that bank. Prior to the advent of smartphones, before suburban expansion consumed agricultural land, before the concept of a man like Maurice could be envisioned, standing serenely with a document, contesting the very core of a multi-million-dollar organization. In 1913, Franklin Delroy, Morris's grandfather, was 23 years old and already recognized within Blount County for his skilled workmanship. His hands constructed churches, schoolhouses, and porches that remained standing a century later. Unbeknownst to many, Franklin was also a member of a discreet, close-knit group of black tradesmen, farmers, and ministers who combined their resources to purchase land. The purpose wasn't financial gain, but a matter of dignity. They identified as the East Bluntland Cooperative, and throughout the years, they obtained small plots on the periphery of what was then essentially cow pasture. However, Franklin, ever the visionary, included a specific provision in his deed. Should the land ever undergo development, leasing, or a claim by another party without a sale, ownership would return to his descendants after a specified duration. In 1927, a lumber company made a payment to lease the land for a limited time. Subsequently, a warehouse was constructed, followed by a small credit union. By the 1970s, that credit union had transformed into a regional bank. And when it was acquired again in 2003, all of the original documents were misplaced overlooked, or lost within the new ownership. The Delroy family was never notified. Franklin was gone by that point. Morris's father, Jasper Langston, attempted to preserve the family's history. However, circumstances grew difficult. Employment opportunities disappeared, and Jasper began drinking. The traditional stories evolved into mere bedtime stories, losing any sense of verifiable truth. Morris recalled sitting on the porch in his youth, listening to his dad describe the plot by the rail tracks that Granddaddy owned. Yet, it held little significance for him. The stories remained just that, stories, until he matured and understood how families like his were frequently excluded from their own history. In 2020, when COVID caused widespread closures and Morris was residing in a church basement in Sevierville, he finally sorted through the last of his father's possessions. Among them, he discovered the original deed carefully wrapped in wax paper, and within it, a small note written in his dad's handwriting. "If you find this, don't let him tell you we didn't leave anything behind." Morris took that note with great importance. He dedicated months to research at the public library. He made trips to the county clerk's office. He consulted with Lena Fry, the probate attorney who remained professional when he shared the story with her. She located the land records and carefully compared parcel numbers, and she verified his findings. The land, now valued at millions, had been leased, not sold. The original clause remained in effect. No legal purchase had ever occurred. Consequently, after years of homelessness, this situation seems quite unusual. Morris entered the building constructed upon his grandfather's land and stated something unexpected. "I believe this belongs to me." At the bank, John Delgado now had the documents spread across his desk. They contained a century's worth of signatures, carbon copies, and ink stamps from courthouses that no longer existed. Gerald, the regional compliance officer, examined one page as if it had committed a personal offense. According to this clause, he stated, "The property returns to the original family if the lease expires without renewal or sale." John confirmed this had occurred twice, and the family was not notified. "That's correct." A significant silence followed. Then Gerald quietly expressed concern, saying, "We're in trouble." Maurice remained seated opposite them, silent. He showed no sign of a smile. However, a sense of calm was evident on his face. It was as if a man had, at long last, joined together all the pieces of a puzzle and possessed the perseverance to complete it. As events aligned within that office, a woman on her lunch break began live streaming the growing disturbance outside the bank. The unfolding situation quickly transcended their internal narrative. The lobby's ambience underwent a change. Initial silent assessment evolved into quiet wonder. The atmosphere then became something different altogether, a palpable sense of nervous anticipation. A teller had moved away from her workspace and was positioned by the coffee machine, appearing to stir sugar while observing the office door as if expecting someone to enter. The security guard had repositioned himself, now standing nearer to Morris's chair, seemingly not for protection, but perhaps to observe. Beyond the glass partitions, John Delgado's office was full. Gerald Tisdale was participating in a video conference with a group of legal representatives from corporate, their faces difficult to interpret. A senior counsel, Mark Levin, repeatedly posed the same inquiry. How did this oversight occur? No one could provide a satisfactory explanation. The numerous transfers of ownership involving various parent companies and banks had obscured the documentation until Morris brought it back to their attention. "There's a public title gap," Gerald stated. "No signed release, no recorded sale." The reversion clause was never satisfied. Mark Levin moved closer to the screen. "Does this man, Langston, possess the original documents?" John stated that he has more than just documents. He has lineage, and we verified the parcel data. It's the same land. The only alterations were the asphalt and steel constructed upon it. Mark pinched his nose. "Okay, here's what we need. Secure a release from this man. Offer a small settlement. Remove him from the building before the press arrives." Maurice, seated quietly nearby, understood their thinking without needing to hear the discussion. He understood the atmosphere. After decades of observing how people assess your value, John ended the call and turned to him. Mr. Langston, would you be willing to settle this today? We could quietly arrange compensation, something equitable. Morris folded his arms. What's fair to you? John paused. That would require negotiation. But if we act quickly, we could avoid unwanted publicity. Maurice chuckled softly. Unwanted by whom? John momentarily looked surprised. A knock sounded at the glass door. A woman, identifiable by the local news logo on her lanyard, smiled and raised her phone. Hello. We've received information that someone entered with a land deed asserting ownership of the bank property. May we speak with Mr. Langston? John's face visibly drained. Who informed you? A voice from the lobby murmured. The live streams have exceeded 12,000 viewers. Morris rose to his feet deliberately. There's nothing to be concerned about. I'm not intending to cause a disturbance. Gerald approached. Mr. Langston, please understand that this situation requires careful handling. It would benefit everyone involved if we could maintain discretion. I attempted a subtle approach, Maurice stated. I'm accustomed to quiet. It defined much of my existence. It yielded no progress. A pause settled over the group. Gerald seemed poised to object, but a palpable truth lingered, inescapable. Returning to the lobby, Brittany spoke softly to Maurice. The amusement had vanished from her face. Do you truly possess this? She inquired. I have always possessed it, he replied. The recollection seemed to simply vanish. She lowered her gaze, a hint of embarrassment visible. I'm sorry. Morris's expression eased a little. It's not your fault. You were instructed on how to behave when someone like me enters. The bank's doors opened once more, and 2 additional reporters entered. A man carried a boom microphone over his shoulder. Another began recording with his phone. Cliff attempted to block their entry. This is private property. A reporter responded, observing Maurice. Not for long. As inquiries began from the media, Maurice did not seek attention. He instead glanced back at the familiar envelope he held, the one that held his family's history across generations, and understood it was time for the world to know it. Maurice needed no microphone. He needed no formal announcement. He simply needed to remain where he was. That was sufficient. A reporter, a woman in her 40s named Kimber Rowland from WBIR, approached. Mr. Langston, could you verify that you assert ownership of the land the bank occupies? Maurice met her gaze, unwavering. I'm not asserting anything, he stated. I'm presenting facts, and the document in my hand demonstrates what none of you ever took the time to investigate. Kimber nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the significance in his tone. What outcome are you pursuing with this? Maurice didn't respond immediately. He turned to address the increasingly large gathering. There were customers, employees, and security present, with some people watching from the sidewalk. What I'm hoping for, he said finally, is that the next time someone walks in looking like I do, maybe people won't react with amusement first. The silence that followed was palpable. The young man who had been laughing earlier near the coffee machine suddenly looked down at his shoes. Brittany tightened her grip on her ID badge and avoided his gaze. Cliff shifted uncomfortably and cleared his throat. Look, sir, I didn't mean any disrespect. You need to comprehend. We simply weren't prepared. There was laughter. Maurice intervened. You all responded that way. The moment I entered the room, you observed my coat, my shoes, the discoloration on my hands, and you determined I was insignificant. No one spoke. Have you ever considered how many people you're likely to dismiss each day? Moving around here as if you possess all the knowledge, as if you've already assessed someone's narrative merely by viewing their exterior. John Delgado moved ahead, attempting to redirect the situation. Mr. Langston, we are ready to offer a formal apology and begin settlement negotiations. Maurice gave him a drawn-out, weary look. Do you still believe this concerns finances? A teenager with a camera phone murmured to his friend, out of view of the reporters, Dude, this person is really committed. Observe the documents. Kimber, perceiving something more significant, inquired, Where have you been until now? What prompted you to come forward at this time? Maurice sighed, not in annoyance, simply in contemplation. Following my dad's passing, I lost interest in matters of this nature. I was preoccupied with basic survival, taking on sporadic jobs like roofing, welding, and janitorial work whenever available. Maintaining stable housing proved difficult when people avoided direct interaction. I experienced periods of both prosperity and hardship, followed by even more challenging times. He paused. There were nights I slept under bridges and mornings I cleaned the same floors people used to ignore me. However, I never discarded that envelope. The memory of every shelter I stayed in, every town I passed through, remained with me. He held it up gently. It's all I had left from a man who believed we were worth more than people thought. And one day, I simply grew weary of silence. A woman from the crowd spoke softly. You kept the deed all these years? Maurice nodded. 50 years it stayed in our family. Passed from one calloused hand to another, Kimber asked. And what now? He surveyed the bank lobby, his gaze lingering on each employee who had assessed him that morning. What now? He repeated. Now you recall my name. From a corner location, Gerald spoke to John. This is going to be a public relations disaster. However, the individuals within the bank weren't observing Gerald. They were observing Maurice. Truly observing. Some for the first time, as if a barrier had been removed. Not just from his narrative, but from theirs as well. You believe I was unseen? Maurice stated softly. I remained present. You simply didn't observe carefully enough. However, the outside world had already begun to notice. They perceived a man who brought more than just a deed to that building. He carried evidence that dignity isn't derived from affluence. It arises from steadfastly maintaining one's identity. By the following morning, the narrative had spread beyond state lines. Every local news station in Tennessee aired a rendition of it. Some reported inaccuracies. A report suggested Maurice had assumed control of the bank, a claim that proved false. Nevertheless, the message spread. Residents of Blount County, particularly older individuals, began searching through attics and storage boxes, questioning what they might have overlooked. College students shared excerpts online with accompanying text, such as this exemplifies generational theft. To them, Maurice wasn't a news item. He represented an alert and a sign. At the bank, the situation quickly worsened. Legal representatives from the corporation arrived from elsewhere. Security personnel were now joined by local police officers patrolling the parking lot, employed for crowd management. Demonstrators had assembled along the sidewalk, displaying cardboard signs. Their messages included phrases like respect land rights. Not just a deed, a legacy. He was right all along. Maurice hadn't organized the gathering, nor had he requested anyone to attend, yet they came. Inside the building, the atmosphere was tense. Gerald Tisdale was pacing once more, his face flushed as he managed calls from corporate and press liaisons. John Delgado was in his office, with the blinds completely shut, feeling the burden of everything. Maurice was in the break room, drinking coffee from paper cup. Never thought I'd be allowed in here, he remarked, mostly to himself. Kimber Rowland had returned, and her camera crew was filming quietly from the parking lot. She wasn't trying to create problems. She was simply waiting for the story to unfold. That afternoon, a legal representative, Clay Addison, entered the bank. He possessed a clean-shaven appearance, a southern drawl, and wore a silk tie that appeared more valuable than Morris's entire wardrobe. He did not offer a smile. Mr. Langston, Clay began, settling across from him, let me start by saying our firm recognizes the validity of your documentation. We are here to discuss terms. Maurice listened intently, remaining still. You placed our client in a complex situation. We acknowledge the oversight and are ready to present a substantial financial offer for the permanent transfer of ownership. A paper was slid across the table by Clay. Maurice looked at it, then raised his gaze. You believe this is the core issue? He inquired, his voice level. It's a considerable sum, Clay stated. It's a price, Maurice replied, and it doesn't come close to covering what you're attempting to resolve. Clay released a sharp breath. What would be acceptable to you? Maurice leaned forward, composed but resolute. I want a plaque with my grandfather's name displayed out front. I also want the official record corrected with the city, and I want a foundation established in his name, one that provides housing for families who have experienced similar circumstances. Clay blinked. Are you serious? I'm absolutely serious. There was a significant pause. Then Clay said, "I will present this to the board. You please do that." Information about the negotiation became public the same day. And when it did, an unforeseen development occurred. People began making donations. People donated online, in person, and by check. One woman from Jackson traveled 2 hours to personally hand Maurice a $20 bill and express her gratitude for him, ensuring they weren't forgotten. The bank subsequently released a brief statement later that week, stating, "We recognize the validity of Mr. Maurice Langston's claim and are working in good faith to resolve this matter respectfully. We have deep appreciation for the legacy of Franklin Delroy and the community he helped build." While corporate and sanitized, this statement was unexpected. Regarding Maurice, there was no celebration. No press conference was held. He simply exited the bank one afternoon, carrying the same envelope he had entered with. However, this time he wasn't alone. 3 generations of Delroys stood with him in spirit, and hundreds more supported them. While legal teams assessed expenses and public relations teams prepared announcements, the most important aspect had already transpired. Someone like Maurice had finally been acknowledged, and the narrative was no longer controlled by the bank. It belonged to everyone who had ever been forgotten. The sun shone that morning. Maurice Langston stood in front of the bank again. Now, he wasn't standing on disputed land. He was standing on his grandfather's land, officially recognized by the city of Knoxville as part of the Franklin Delroy Legacy Trust. It wasn't just a name on paper anymore. A new plaque had been installed outside the bank's main entrance, embedded in a small brick pedestal near the sidewalk. Bronze letters, clear and lasting. Dedicated to Franklin Delroy, 1890 to 1954, builder, father, landowner. His legacy endures. Maurice touched it softly. The plaque felt cool beneath his fingertips. He remained silent. Words weren't necessary. A small group had assembled for the unveiling. Community leaders, students from the local university, reporters, and some of the same bank staff who previously ridiculed him were present. Brittany stood at the rear, her hands clasped, attempting to make eye contact with Maurice whenever he turned. This time he succeeded. The foundation he had proposed was already being established. A partnership with a local nonprofit was formed within weeks of the settlement. The Delroy Housing Fund would provide grants to families at risk of homelessness, particularly those who have been disadvantaged by legal complexities and overlooked actions. "I didn't desire revenge," Maurice told Kimber Rowland in his final interview. "I simply wanted the truth to endure beyond the falsehood." It had taken years to reach this point. For years, he had experienced being overlooked, marginalized, and disregarded. However, the instant he entered through those glass doors, holding a creased envelope and a legacy of suffering, things began to shift. And currently, he was simply a man identified by a name. He had acquired a modest, well-kept house not distant from the outskirts of Alcoa, close to the same areas where his father had previously constructed porches and fences. It wasn't elaborate, merely a neat area, a functional sink, a bed to relax in. Occasionally, he would sit on a plastic chair outside, sipping coffee and greeting children cycling up the slope. On other occasions, he collaborated with local high schools, discussing land ownership, family histories, and the consequences of oblivion with students. Preserve your documents, he advised them. Retain your names. Ensure no one erases your people from the narrative. People now referred to him as Mr. Langston. At times, even Sir, but the designation he valued most was the one his grandfather had attained. Builder. It wasn't about buildings, but about something larger. Legacy. He never anticipated forgiveness from the bank. However, it wasn't necessary. What he required, he received: an acknowledgement, a correction, and the opportunity for those who followed to declare, "I belong here too." The bank continued its operations, but the employees carried themselves differently. They engaged with people they had previously overlooked. They posed questions rather than making assumptions. The transformation wasn't flawless, but it represented a meaningful shift. One afternoon, several months following the resolution of events, Brittany approached him outside the community center. "Mr. Langston?" she asked, her voice betraying nervousness. Yes, he replied. I've been taking night classes. Real estate law. He raised an eyebrow. Is that so? He inquired. After everything that happened, I realized how much I didn't know. About ownership, history, how things get passed down or lost. Morris smiled, slow and genuine. Good for you. She paused. I'm sorry for how I treated you that first day. He nodded. An apology wasn't necessary. It was owed to the individual who would next enter. She considered this thoughtfully, responding, yes, I will. He retrieved a copy of the original deed, a replica, to be exact, from his coat and gave it to her. Keep this. Use it in class. Teach someone something. She accepted it with care, as if it were fragile. As she departed, Morris looked towards the street and observed a group of teenagers assembling at the bus stop across the road. One of them gestured towards the plaque. The others drew closer to listen. He remained silent, allowing them to continue. He simply observed, a quiet sense of pride welling up within him as his grandfather's name emerged in the discussion once more. Perhaps that's how genuine transformation truly begins. Not through rage, nor solely through the pursuit of justice, but through remembrance and the bravery to keep it alive. Should you experience a feeling while hearing Morris's narrative, do not hold it back. Spread it. Discuss it. And if there's a family name you haven't mentioned in some time, vocalize it. The impact of legacies endures only when we actively preserve them. Subscribe for more stories that illuminate the true meaning of dignity.